Mm.
Okay. One of the highlights of this year's Melbourne Documentary Film Festival is a film called Sing Freetown. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the director of Sing Freetown, Clive Patterson. Clive, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Thank you very much, and good to talk to you, Peter.
Such a fascinating documentary about this National Theatre production about Freetown in Sierra Leone, and about two people in particular, Soros and Charlie. How did the whole documentary first come about?
So I had spent over a decade working with Soros. We both worked for the same independent documentary production company. And actually my career very much developed alongside him. When I first arrived at the company, I was really just starting out, and I cut my teeth and grew as a filmmaker working on films with him. So he was a very close colleague, is a close colleague, is a very close friend, but was also something of a mentor for me. And the company itself specialized in films from Africa, and he was one of our most celebrated reporters really in the UK. He'd made a name for himself as a reporter of African affairs for British television and international television. So our relationship, really, the project grew out of the fact that we had a pre-existing relationship. But really, you know, over the decade that I'd spent working with Soros, I'd become aware that he had grown more and more disillusioned with the kind of negative stories that he was often commissioned to do or to tell, the kind of stories that he was always being asked to tell from his continent, often fixating on, sort of disasters, crime, corruption, outbreaks, you know, disease. And he was just really getting sick and tired of it, to be honest. And he wanted to tell other kinds of stories that also celebrated the rich historical, cultural legacy, or just contemporary society and interesting things that are happening across the continent. So, you know, in the end, that didn't happen through any broadcaster and their interest in doing something like that. Soros met somebody who had interest in Sierra Leone, also had interest in documentaries, and was also wanted to tell a story from Sierra Leone, his home country, which was, you know, shining a positive light on the country, rather than, again, just perpetuating many of the negative stereotypes that we've become accustomed to. In the case of Sierra Leone, that would be like civil war, child soldiers, blood diamond, Ebola. You know, the only times you ever see Sierra Leone kind of in the international media is often in association with those kinds of stories. So a lady, a philanthropist, she decided that she wanted to support a documentary project with Soros where he could tell a story, a positive story. And so he decided that he wanted to collaborate with his great friend and mentor, Charlie Hafner, the theatre artist in Sierra Leone, to go on a journey to create this big play, this sort of epic work of national theatre to kind of revive and to reinvigorate a more positive culture identity, I guess, for the country. And that's how it all started. Quite a long answer, sorry, but that's the story.
But a good one, because it gives the audience a really good idea about how this whole film came about. And it's so interesting that that's the concept and the idea. But of course, as things develop, things do happen. And you must have been quite intrigued as to the way Soros and Charlie developed their friendship, relationship, and the whole production that is supposed to being put to this theatrical event. That must have been quite an interesting challenge for you, filming all of that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, things got challenging during the course of the story. The most difficult and challenging aspect of that was really, in a way, bearing witness to this profound friendship. And I love both of these guys. I mean, Soros, as I've mentioned, is a very good friend of mine and has been a great mentor to me. I knew how much he loved Charlie. Charlie was this fantastic figure. I mean, I met him in 2015 for the first time, and he's just such a soulful, but also deeply inspirational, intelligent, really fascinating person who's done so much for the country as well. And so understanding the depth of their friendship, and then watching that friendship really suffer during the course of this project, it meant so much to both of them, particularly to Soros, because this was really his opportunity after decades of telling negative stories. This was his opportunity to try and tell a positive story. And of course, when things start going wrong, that dream starts to unravel somewhat, and that puts a lot of pressure on him emotionally, as you see during the course of the story. And that was difficult, you know, and particularly difficult to really sort of maintain a sort of relationship, that a sort of equal relationship with both of them, because obviously things get tense between them. I think Charlie understandably felt that I might be predisposed to see things from Soros's side more. And it was very important to me, of course, that I maintained his trust and that he trusted me to tell the story fairly from both sides. I guess that was probably the most tricky part of it. But the overall journey with them, you know, filming over a year and a half in the end, was really just a joy, to be honest. I mean, it was such a joy to be able to make a film with more time, and they're such amazing companions. I learned so much about the country, and it was just a fascinating way to learn about Sierra Leone through these two men, who are both in their own rights very well known in Sierra Leone for their respective achievements. So really it was just a joy and a pleasure and a privilege, not without its challenges, but I really remember it very fondly as an experience.
Well, it certainly comes across really very well. It's such an interesting depiction of creating this theatrical play, and I can see your ethical dilemmas, I suppose, in trying to be as you know, being fair to both of them as much as possible. But were there times when either of them said, "Look, you can't film this," or "I want things to be changed," or I mean, how much of their involvement was there in your narrative?
Not much, to be honest. They were both very open. Really, they kind of bared their souls to me in the making of this film, which is something which I really appreciate, continue to appreciate, and continue to have tremendous respect for. These are both highly distinguished men who have considerable status, and they really were willing to go on this very raw, ultimately emotional journey, which was quite exposing in certain ways. They never said, really, I can't think of a single time that they said, "I'm not going to answer that question," or "I don't want you to film this." They really were engaged and wanted to, I guess, just offer themselves for the story. And when it came to the post-production and in the editing, I did send them cuts for their notes. I just wanted to know, you know, did they have any thoughts? Was there anything in there that was particularly difficult or uncomfortable that they didn't agree with, or whatever? And you know, they were both just very happy to allow me to tell the story how I saw it. And I think they felt probably they could trust me based on what they'd seen as cuts were emerging. In fact, Charlie just didn't even watch the cuts. You know, I think he watched the first 5 minutes of the first cut that I sent him, and then he just said, "Look, Clive, you know, to be honest, I just want to let you do your thing. I trust you. This is your film. You interpret the events, and I'll see it when it's done." Soros, he watched the films at least, did have some thoughts, but was never vetoing anything, and never sort of put his foot down in a way which forced my hand, you know. So to that extent, it was a fully independent editorial process.
Oh, really interesting to hear that. I mean, Freetown, this whole notion of a city in a country which to some extent was so impacted by slavery and which has gone through such an incredible journey as a country, Sierra Leone, to have this national theatrical production which tries to bring everyone together. And in a way, it's, I suppose you could call it reconciliation and a positive moving forward to re-establish the country. So in a way, your documentary has sort of charted that, I suppose, to a major extent.
Yeah. I mean, the film, I guess, has sort of different aspirations, you know. On the one hand, it was to document and to tell the story of the making of this play. On the other hand, it is really a film about these two men and their friendship, and you know, trying to understand who they are at a deeper level, what it is that's informed their lives at the most fundamental level. But then, of course, you know, the story of Sierra Leone itself as a nation, and the difficulties they've faced, of course, in recent years, but also this tremendous heritage. And the sort of Sierra Leone just has a tremendous story all of its own, you know. The actual origin of the country, or at least the modern country, and the stories behind that and its place in the world is truly unique and remarkable. And you know, the formation of Freetown, which used to be called the Province of Freedom, really a kind of almost a sort of utopian idea of a place in Africa where freed slaves from North America could return and rebuild their lives on their own continent. According to a range of historical literature, I mean, Freetown held the first ever truly universal democratic elections in world history, you know, where women could vote, and that was, you know, in the early days of the settlement. But that kind of heritage sort of continued through until independence, really. I mean, it was a sort of, as Charlie says in the film, the country was a citadel of education, had the first modern university of any country in Africa. So anyway, I mean, all these the sort of the story of Sierra Leone, including much of the modern day difficulty, and these two men are on a journey, as you say, to kind of reconcile, in a way, the notion of the country. The country has fallen on very hard times. There's no doubt about that. They are very worried about their country, and they see all kinds of, you know, sort of divisions developing, and a real loss of hope, and a loss of belief in what the country is, or the notion of national pride is pretty sort of distant. And so really their mission is to try and foster and to recreate through this play, this kind of unifying, empowering story of actually what the country does have to offer. And to that extent, you know, I think the film is a rich film, because there are all these different sort of diverse elements that are intertwining. It's not just about a play, you know, it's really about the soul of this country. And then it's all kind of captured through the prism of these remarkable men who have their own remarkable stories to tell. And of course, the differences of attitude and opinion that ultimately causes them to fall into conflict as well. It's a pretty diverse sort of mix of story elements in the end. It was pretty hard to edit it well. I have to say it took a while, but I think we got there in the end.
And I'm glad you did, because that's what I found so interesting. And as a filmmaker, you must have contemplated at one stage the risk that this play would not even be produced, would not happen. That could have been a potential disaster.
Oh, it was an awful thought that was preying on me, and, you know, sort of entering my nightmares, you know, during the darker days of that story. It was worrying. And I know that, again, Soros felt this, he number one, he had this great desire to sort of tell a positive story, and the whole thing starting to unravel in front of him. And that causes great distress for him. And you can see that kind of coming out really, because, he couldn't believe that this project, it was a dream for him to go on a journey with his best friend, Charlie Hafner, to create a play that's going to reframe the narrative of their nation and cast their nation in a positive light, the kind of thing that he'd never have a chance to do working for, current affairs in the UK or CNN. And here it is all kind of like falling apart. There were times when it did look like it just really might not happen. And then what? The story would have been so depressing. And the outcome for, I guess kind of what it just would have been such a depressing end. And for a story that promised so much, and given the intention really of the whole project, it would have been deeply depressing. And so I am eternally grateful that they had it within themselves to get through the difficulties they faced and to refocus their attention on their common cause. And I think ultimately that's kind of there are sort of a number of deeper messages in the film, but certainly one of them is about how conflict and then resolution of conflict, where people can train their mind on actually what they care about more, the common interests and common ambitions and common aspirations, and in the end they get there. And it's I'm so glad the ending, I think, is quite rewarding.
It is absolutely very rewarding. Just as an aside, the financing of the play, I found that a very interesting issue about how much money was going to be placed to the play, and then who would get paid and how that would happen. I found that, I suppose, somewhat symbolic about, I suppose, what's happening in Sierra Leone right now.
Yeah, well, it was a kind of wild journey, the sort of fundraising side of it. I mean, obviously, it ultimately, money, the problem of money, becomes pretty big part of the story. And I think the fact is that, without resources, people can't do very much, and I think any society or any leader of any sector in any society says, well, we need resources to kind of really do stuff. And one of the problems in Sierra Leone is that there's just no money for cultural space. I mean, the country is so poor, it's a travesty because it's so rich in mineral wealth and things, but nonetheless, it's a very poor country. It's right near the bottom of, global indicators. And they don't have money for cultural space. There's no money. There's no like arts institution. There's no arts funding. Charlie, as a theater, sort of a artist, made his career ultimately by just going into the streets and performing on street corners and developing a kind of reputation as a guerrilla theater artist. And he was so committed and so dedicated to this that he just persevered, and then managed to eventually make a living by, people recognized his talent, and organizations like the UN would employ him to disseminate messages of sanitation or health or whatever it was. And he would go around the country performing plays and creating plays with these kinds of messages and collaborating with communities so that, these kinds of really like development initiatives would succeed. And that's the only way that he could really sort of support his creative endeavors. So, the idea of like putting on a big sort of stage production hadn't really been done for a very long time. And very quickly, they do come up against the difficulty of actually really raising interest in even something like this. Something like this hasn't been done for a long time. People are cash strapped, and the idea of just like putting money into a sort of play is pretty foreign. So, I mean, the fundraiser is a pretty interesting scene. Of course, later on, when they do eventually manage to secure a pretty significant sponsorship deal with the local brewery, that then throws up its own problems in the form of corruption and things. And at every turn, when it comes to finances, the fact of, countries that are impoverished, where people are struggling, where even those that are in good positions have a pretty complex relationship with money, and the way that corruption has become totally endemic, it became one of the most difficult parts of the whole journey, really.
How interesting to hear all of that. So you mentioned before the editing, and it's always so interesting, the editing process in a documentary and finding the story, finding the narrative, etc. You must have had some challenges there about the edit, using other footage, whatever, to put the film together. Can you talk about the decisions you had to make?
I'm not going to lie, editing this film was a nightmare. I mean, again, like I said, it was a joy, but it was difficult. It went through a whole range of iterations, and it wasn't really until kind of almost right near the end that it felt like the balance was just struck just in time, because we were kind of running out of money, of course, and time. I had so much footage. I had never made an observational film before. I'm a current affairs filmmaker, or at least that was my background. And so I'm kind of more accustomed to short, intensive shoots, 2 weeks, where you film in quite a sort of highly disciplined manner to get the sequences that you need. And then you can sort of you edit the film in like 3 weeks. In this case, I was shooting on and off for a year and a half. And because it's observational, you're never quite sure what's going to happen. So my attitude was just to kind of film, as much as possible. Just keep filming. If you never know what might happen. Of course, the sort of negative, well, not the negative, but the consequence of that is that you end up with hundreds of hours of material. And I must have had at least 500 hours of footage, if not like 6 or 7. So just the sheer quantity initially was kind of quite daunting. Of course, I had a sense of where the strongest scenes were, but again, I did film quite a lot of different things, and I was just interested in trying to tell the story. I mean, on the one hand, there's a story of the play, that's fine, and that's kind of captured in some sort of, that's just what it is. But then it's the stories that sort of dive into Soros and Charlie, their personal backstories, their character, the story of the Freetown players, the story of Sierra Leone, the slightly more stylized sequences, I guess, in the film, of which there were quite a large number in the end. And just marrying or trying to find the right balance so that, on the one hand, the story of the play is the kind of like main narrative propulsion. And you never want to get too far away from that, because that's the kind of journey that you're sort of on. But actually, you really do want to somehow get deeper with these guys as well. And you want to get deeper with the country. And the challenge of like peeling away from the core narrative to essentially have these segues into their personal backstories or into certain things that have been so important to them. I guess an example of that might be the story about Sengbe Pie, who is the slave who features in the Spielberg movie, in fact, Amistad. But you have Charlie taking us to this classroom, which was this kind of like epiphanal moment for him, where he first learned, for the first time ever at the age of 35, of this incredible slave hero who was famous in America and had books written about him. And yet in Sierra Leone, no one really knew about him. And it was kind of indicative of how he, as he put it, they'd been sort of robbed of their own history, partly as a result of colonial education. The Brits didn't want to educate Sierra Leoneans about these rebellious heroes. And so, he learned of this man in that classroom, and, he found himself weeping, and it inspired him so profoundly. So it's a great story, and it, tells you something about who he is. and about what set him off on his journey to kind of like reclaim the country's history. It also tells you a great story about Sierra Leone, but nonetheless, it's got nothing to do with the making of the play. And so kind of finding the right way of like, you know, preparing an audience for a segue like that, and making it feel like you want to go into these segues, and it not feeling like a digression, and you don't lose momentum with the rest of the story. All of that was pretty tough. And at times it felt like it's not working. I better just stick with the story of the play. Like, you know, I'm sort of trying to do too much here. It's all getting too unwieldy. In the end though, it just came together, and I just so glad I had some additional time to keep working on it. So eternally thankful to particularly Katie, who's the exec producer and primary financier of the film, to give that time so that we could really get the balance right. And I hope we have.
I feel you have. It was really quite compelling viewing. I'm intrigued. How did Soros and Charlie respond to the final cut of the film?
Both basically, I mean, so I would say that initially Charlie was slightly troubled by it. I know that Soros went to Sierra Leone for just a family trip, but he had the final cut with him, and he and Charlie sat down together to watch it for the first time. And Soros had already seen it. Soros really liked it. Soros thought it was a pretty astonishing rendition of the journey they'd gone on. He was really like, wow, yeah, that's a good film, Clive, well done. Charlie, when he first saw it, kind of like sat in sort of silence for a few minutes, left the room, and then came back and was like, well, what do you think, Soros? You know, and I think he didn't quite know, but Soros and also the other person in the room, Daddy Mo, the guy that turns up near the end of the film, he's the kind of events manager that's trying to help them get the play off the ground. He was there as well. And Mo was just like really enthusiastic about it. And I think both of their reactions sort of helped Charlie to sort of actually lean into what he also deep down felt, was that he really liked the film. And once he'd gotten over that initial shock, I think, of like just seeing himself depicted honestly, but also in quite a raw way. I think it was, you know, it was just like I said, he's a distinguished man, and it was probably quite an experience just to sort of see that story, you know, suddenly thrown up on the big screen like that. But you know, we brought him over to the UK for our world premiere, and for us, we had a limited theatrical release here in the UK in the cinemas. He really embraced the film. And by the end, I mean, you know, as the Q&As went on, more and more, he was just expressing his love for the film, really. He thought it was an amazing piece of work. He just couldn't believe it, really. Couldn't believe that, like, that had been produced out of this kind of long, meandering, complex, difficult, tetchy journey that we'd gone on for a year and a half. He was like, whoa. You know, for example, like this, the Freetown players, you know, the group that turn up singing. I mean, he founded that group, but he had no idea that, you know, they were going to sort of appear in the film in that way. And so I think little sort of flourishes like that were just like, for him, really, like, he loved that because that's his group, you know, and they have a lovely part to play in the story. So he came to embrace the film wholeheartedly. And we just had our Sierra Leonean premiere, in fact. So we went to Freetown last month and actually screened it in the same auditorium where the play had its premiere. And it was a fantastic occasion. It's of course, Sierra Leoneans, that's the most important audience for this film. So it was great to see their reaction and to see how well the film was received. The president came to the screening, which was kind of astonishing. Yeah, he's actually in the film as well. Of course, there's that kind of sequence where they're taking those drums to the great and the good of the country. But yeah, no, they both really embraced the film, which is really rewarding for me. And the family, that was the other thing as well. I was slightly concerned about Charlie's family, even though he had embraced the film. You know, his daughter, his children, you know, his sisters, and so they all came to that screening in Freetown, and they all loved it. So that was really meaningful.
I can imagine it would be great for you and for the film. So well done. Just to conclude, Clive, I'm always interested in this. Are you working on another film at the moment?
I am. I mean, I'm not directing anything at the moment. I'm sort of currently in production on 2 feature-length documentaries. So, I mean, I now run the company what I used to work for, Insight TWI Films. So I'm running that now with my colleague Hugh, and so we have 2 feature-length documentaries in production. Yeah, they're both going to be finished around sort of early next year, and I think they're going to be on Netflix actually, and I'm really excited about both of them because I think they're going to be pretty really strong films.
I look forward to them. Have you got titles for them?
Yeah, working titles. I mean, I'm not sure really how much I'm allowed to say about them, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I understand. Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. Look, congratulations on Sing Freedom screening as part of the
Sing Freetown.
Sing Freetown.
Yeah.
How can I get that wrong? Sing Freetown. I'll get it right.
Yeah.
So congratulations on Sing Freetown screening as part of the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival. And we've been speaking to the director, Clive Patterson. Clive, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you, Peter. Pleasure.
All the best. Bye-bye.